Step one on this project will be to measure 5 boxes across the top of your paper. Now, if you're just using computer paper and a pencil, because that's all you have, just do 1-inch boxes. So I took a ruler and I measured out 5 boxes that are right next to each other, and they're 1-inch square across the top of the page here. And I left these little nick marks above and below so I could see where the boxes are going to end above and below here, because these middle lines are going to eventually disappear. Please draw these as light as possible with your pencil so that when you come in with value, these lines will eventually disappear and you don't have this big black line there that you have to deal with. Step 2 is going to be to take box number 1 and go as dark as you can and as even toned as you can with your pencil. Now, if you're using charcoal and you have your full pad, that's okay. Do the same thing, but go 5 boxes across the top, 1.5 inches square instead of 1 inch, just to help you guys. They're actually easier when they're bigger when you're using charcoal. But either way, once you have 5 across the top here, fill in box number 1 as dark as you can get it. Now, if you just have a pencil, you can go darker than you think you can. You don't realize how dark your graphite pencil can go. Yes, it can only go to sort of a dark gray. It can't go black, but get it as dark as you can get it and get it as even toned as you can get it. If you're using charcoal, you might have to go in and even out the tone with your pinky or with a paper towel and then reapply the charcoal to get it as black as you can get it. Okay, the next step in this is to move on to box number 2 and 3. And what I want you to do is take your pencil and fill in a nice even tone. Remember, the rules to this are you have to have completely even tone. It can't be blotchy. It can't be a different value from one side of the square to the other. It has to be the same. So if it is blotchy, you want to even that out as much as possible. But what I've done here is I've taken box 2 and 3 and I've made them the same value, but what I'm going to try to do here is get a 3 value scale for right now. So I'm just doing dark, mid, and light. Now the key is when you always want to squint for everything. So that helps you get even tone. It helps you read the values a lot better. The way I get an even move from 1, 2, and 3 is when I squint, I want to see that the contrast where it goes from dark to middle and where it goes from middle to light is the same. Now currently, as I'm looking at this, when I squint, the contrast between these two, this edge right here jumps out at me, grabs my eyes a lot more than the one between here and here. So what that means is this contrast is greater on this edge, so these need to go darker. Because when I squint, I want to see the contrast between these two and the contrast between these two to jump out at my eyes equally. So I'm gonna work these a little bit darker. Okay, that's a little bit better now. When I squint, the edge between these two kind of jumps out at my eyes similarly as the edge between these two. That's how you really judge that you're getting an even step between dark, middle, and light. Now there might be a little bit of glare on this, so it might not read as dark just because of the lights in my studio here. But that's the next step. So you want number 1, maybe I'll label these, number 1 to be the darkest. We have 2, 3, 4, and 5. So right now 4 and 5 are just wide of the page, 2 and 3 are a mid-tone, and 1 is the darkest. All right, so we've split the difference, right? We've had dark, all the way light, and then we split the difference between those two. Now what we're going to do is split the difference between 1 and 3 and 3 and 5. So the similar thing that you have going on here where you're reading this contrast the same, it's jumping out at your eyes the same, you want that same thing to happen when we read from 1 to 2 to 3. So when I go here to 2, I'm going to darken this so that the steps are even between 1, 2, and 3. And then similarly, when I go to 3, 4, and 5, I want those steps even as well. All right, that about wraps it up. My number 4, I went a little bit too dark on, so I went back in with a eraser and lifted up. And not only did I lift up a little bit, but I also evened out the tone. Because remember, these are supposed to read like they're just pieces of gray construction paper that are cut out. That's how even you want to try to get this tone. The other thing I did is kind of cleaned up the edges on top and bottom. so that I can use this. You're going to be using this as a tool to read your values when we do our thumbnails. Okay, so I've cut this out, and what I've done is cut it along the edge right against the gradient up there. That's so that when we're doing our thumbnails, you can lay this thing down and right next to another value you're working on and make sure that it's the proper value. Okay, our next step is going to be to draw out the thumbnail boxes. These are 3 inches by 4 inches, and they're completely isolated. Notice they're not touching. If they were touching each other without this gap in between, they would read as the same design, and we want these to read as separate designs. Now, the point of this assignment is to use value to make a good design to compose with, so that we're thinking about this whole page, this whole paper as a window onto a world that we're looking at here. So we're not just focused on objects, we're focused on how to compose with value. And the way to do that is to look at it abstractly. Instead of thinking about objects, we're just going to be thinking about value shapes. So I have the gradient here that we did earlier. You're going to use that as a key to assign values to each one of these. Now I have 2. You're going to end up with 4. I just have 2 here as examples, but for your assignment, you're going to have the value gradient, and you're going to have another piece of paper with 4 value designs on here. So here are the rules. The same as your value gradient that you have down here. There's 5 values. They're all even steps. So as we go from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, remember you split those in half, you assign different values, and each one of those has an even step as it moves on to the next one. They're all hard-edged, so there's no blending in between values, and they're all even tone. There's no blotchiness going on. Remember, it's supposed to look like separate pieces of construction paper that have been cut out and glued down. That's what's going to happen over here. Now, the way we design with these, though, there's some rules. Instead of just assigning the same area of values across this, we're going to be creative in the way that we use this. And the way to help us do that is to look at these rules over here. One of the shapes that you assign, doesn't matter what value, but one of the shapes has to be huge. And I'm talking maybe 50% or more of this area. Another shape has to be really tiny. So I don't know, 5% or so of the area over here. It all has to be non-representational, so we can't have an eye or a tribal sun or mountains or anything like that. It has to be purely abstract. And non-representational means the fullest extent abstract. It's not an abstracted tree, it's completely non-representational. It's just purely shapes. And once again, isolate these thumbnails so they're not touching each other. Now, when I go to assign values to this thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend like I have a pizza cutter, because we want to keep our shapes fairly simple. I'm going to pretend that this is a sheet cake or like a pan pizza, like a sheet pizza, and I have a pizza cutter, and I'm going to be cutting this up into 5 different shapes. And I want to make these as interesting as possible and as varied as possible, and that's why we got these rules here. But I want you to divide this up into 5 shapes, and you're going to do different ones with each one of these. You're going to cut these up differently. And the point is to try to compose an interesting design with just abstract values. Before making your thumbnails, I just wanted to point out a couple of things you should avoid. This is by no means comprehensive, but just a couple of things I want you to look out for. The first thing is corners. So these 2 are examples of 2 ways that you can evenly slice off a corner. Anytime you do that, whether it's going directly into a corner or evenly cutting off the corner, you always call attention to that corner, and you want to try to avoid that. So if you go to slice a shape like this and your slice is running right into the corner, try to avoid that by maybe having it come down and not touch the corner. On this one over here, instead of having it evenly come across here, instead try to slice it in a more irregular triangle so it doesn't call more attention to that corner. Then we have tangents. These are 2 examples of tangents. Over here we have a slice, a curved slice, and it's coming up and touching right at the edge. It can either touch at the edge or touch another slice right at its tangent, and anytime you do that, it creates an awkward moment in the composition. So anytime you bump up against this, you either want to pull that circle out, that curved line out, so it's not touching the edge, even if it's really close, or crop it so that this curved thing goes off the edge of the page and then comes back. Whether it's doing it here or touching another line in here, it creates that same sort of awkward crash in a design. Over here we have another example of tangents where these lines just run straight through. You might want to shake this up by doing something like this, so that we don't have all of these lines converging right there. We shake that up a little bit and we get more of a sense of an overlap, and it creates more space. The last thing I want you to try to avoid is isolated shapes. This isn't necessarily a no-no in design in general. I just don't want you to do this. I want all of these shapes interacting, once again, just like if you had that pizza cutter. So there's a number of ways you can do this. You can have this shape just coming off of the next shape there, so it's interacting with it. Or, you could continue that all the way to the top. Either way, try to not have these little isolated shapes. Have them interacting with the other shapes. Okay, so I got my one abstract thumbnail here. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you may have noticed in the midst of this, I changed this shape a little bit to avoid a tangency going on right here. There's just a little triangle, but I scooted this part down and made a little slice coming in here. I can take my eraser and kind of go in and perform a little bit of brain surgery here, vascular surgery. And if it gets a little bit blotchy, I can kind of very lightly lift out some of those blotches and try to even out some of that tone. Because that's really what I'm looking for, is just as if you had gray pieces of paper and you cut those out in these shapes and laid them down. Keep it simple, but really try to experiment with, geometric cuts versus organic curved cuts. How big can you make a shape? How small can you make a shape? Don't just, turn your brain off and just throw on a bunch of shapes. Really think about how doing things like putting your highest value right next to your lowest value can really create a focal point right there, because it calls your eye over to it. And really try to stretch your creative ability with just using these abstract shapes.